have a couple of things to say before we get started. I read this during my last interview also, but we had some audio issues, so no one but my guest heard it. There are going to be people who resent this departure from our usual format and will tell me that we're a history channel, not a political channel. I am sorry to break it to you, but the study of history is never apolitical, and we are living through some pretty historical times right now. This week has seen protests and riots across the USA in response to the death of George Floyd, a black man, at the hands of a white police officer. This is not just about George Floyd, though. This is about the fact that Black Americans are disproportionately killed by the police force that is sworn to protect and serve. A report published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America in 2019 found that non-white people, including Black people, American Indian people, Alaskan Native people, are more likely than white women and men to be killed by police. The risk of death at the hands of police is highest for Black men, who face a 1 in 1,000 chance of being killed by the police over the course of their lifetime. In contrast, the average risk is roughly 1 in 2,000 for men and 1 in 33,000 for women. The Fatal Force website, compiled and maintained by the Washington Post, records the deaths of 1,004 people who were shot and killed by the police in 2019. 249 of these people were Black, 25% of the total, despite the fact that only 13.4% of the US population is Black. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade are all Black Americans who have lost their lives, either due to the police or due to people acting as though they were police. This is a moment in time in which Black people, already dying at disproportionate rates from the COVID-19 epidemic, are saying that enough is enough. Whatever your opinions on the protests, the anger, and the rioting that currently grips the United States, it is apparent that, to many people, to many police officers, Black lives simply do not matter as much as white lives, and that force, rather than de-escalation, is the preferred response. Black lives matter, and Black voices need to be heard. Listen to them. Hello, everyone. That was a
Hello.
Slightly different introduction than normal, but please, for the love of God, listen to it and listen to the Black people who are crying out for help and support and for change. Welcome to Digital Hammurabi. Thank you for joining us. My guest today is Bet Hucks. Bet, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for reading that statement.
Oh, you are welcome. Bet is a Ph.D. student at the University of Heidelberg and has very kindly agreed to talk to us about both her doctoral project as well as the importance of diversity in academia. And I'm going to say right now, if you don't think diversity in academia is important, I don't much care. So please don't leave comments telling me that it's not important. Please don't give us questions asking us to explain why it is important. Have a listen and try and see it from our perspective, please. Bethany, thank you again for coming on the channel. Could you give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself and how you got into the field?
Sure. So I am sort of a latecomer to a PhD program. I did my undergraduate at Harvard University, and I graduated at the height of the financial crisis in 2009. And from then, I knew that I wanted to work in museums, but it was not feasible to do that. So I worked in marketing and got in to financial marketing, basically, and industry leadership strategies and all of that kind of thing, while volunteering at museums and going to night school and doing things to try to advance my career. In 2015, I went back to school in Florence, Italy, and got my master's in museum studies. And during my master's, I started studying specifically the collection of Emperor Hadrian. Mostly my interest lay along the lines of the things that he brought back from Egypt. And despite his 2 trips to Egypt, the things that he chose to make in either Egyptian material, but Roman style, or using local Roman materials, but in containing Egyptian stylistic elements, and how he put all of that together, and what was this idea of sort of authenticity Why did he feel the need to put things together in this kind of way, and what did it say to him? So for my PhD thesis, I'm expanding on that work to talk about materiality and display and authenticity at 3 sites in Rome and Tivoli from the 1st through 3rd century CE. I'm looking at creating a database of all of this kind of material, which is called Aegyptiaca Romana. And I am putting it all together, doing statistical analyses of them, but also creating 3D models using SketchUp, which I hope to 3D print into physical models for display so that people can get an idea of how these pieces would have looked in situ. So for instance, some of the most famous Aegyptiaca, Hadrian's, is in the Vatican, and it's kept separately from the things that it was actually displayed alongside. So the typical Greco-Roman white statues, although many of them were painted or otherwise colored at the time, were actually in the same spaces as those black marble statues. But they've been traditionally displayed separately, but also looked at separately by scholars until very recently, until the late 90s. They were analyzed as separate and analyzed as often lower class, less worthy of study. The seminal work on Aegyptiaca from Rome is 1976 thesis that was published by Anne Roulette, and she describes them as shining black monstrosities. So there's a lot of work to be done to have people think about ideas of identity and how Romans incorporated identities from the peripheries of their empire, and how they saw that the empire and themselves.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And so I sent you a bunch of questions, but just talking, I'm going to have like 8 million more. Where generally were these things displayed when they were commissioned?
Well, there are several different kinds of ways that people would have displayed them, but also there's personal jewelry. So the goddess Isis became the most popular goddess throughout the Roman Empire. You can find statues and inscriptions of Isis as far north as Hadrian's Wall. And there are temples to her that were in Cologne and in London and in Paris, before they were obviously Cologne, London, and Paris as we think of them today. But that means that she was very popular because she was a goddess of sailors and of mothers and young children. So that means that her appeal was really broad, but she could also be combined in interesting ways that made her even more popular. So for instance, in Rome, there's a small lararium, like a household shrine dedicated to Isis that was on the Esquiline Hill, and it has a statue of Isis Fortuna. So it's the statue dedicated to women, sailors, and other things, grain at certain points, and in combination with her aspect as luck. So you can basically take the aspect of Isis that appeals to you and combine it with your friendly local goddess to become really popular. So that means that you have personal shrines, you have massive temples like the Aeseum Campense in Rome, which I'm looking at. You have things like obelisks, which were either brought back from Rome, ancient obelisks, or contemporary for Roman obelisks brought back and displayed. And you have everything as small as personal jewelry and, sort of totems that you would carry for luck. So the size and breadth of material is quite large. So
this would have been very, very pervasive.
Yes, extremely. And there are temples to Isis that are obviously the most famous one is in Pompeii. But there are wonderful temples, and not just Isis, but Osiris, Harpocrates, and then Osiris and his aspect of Serapis, which is more a sort of Zeus combination invented by the Ptolemies when they were ruling Egypt. So there are many different ways in which the material came over. And some of it was ancient material even then that was brought over for display or usage. And some of it was modern stuff made for Romans that was never in use in Egypt.
Fascinating. So as well as the the divine statuary, do you have instances of Roman emperors being portrayed as pharaohs or as Egyptian, like in Egyptian style?
Absolutely, although most of that happens in numismatic form. So ancient coinage was used to send out political messages. So for instance, when Egypt falls to Rome, you get a coin that says 🀭Capta with a crocodile on it to signify Rome. You have things like, not necessarily sort of, they're empirical forms, but it's not the emperor himself. You have these statues of the Nile sort of being at a lower position on the coin than the emperor, etc. Or he's treading on a crocodile or standing on the back of some other symbol to symbolize Egypt. Yeah. So most of that happens in coinage form, but you do get a lot of images of the Nile as part of the empire in statuary and fountains and things.
That's very cool. Thank you. So what kinds of purposes do you think these borrowings would have served for the Romans? Would it purely have been like with the coins a political statement of superiority, or would there have been like messages of inclusion and trying to build like a cohesive empire? I'm not sure multicultural is the correct word. I don't know if ancient Rome had a concept of multiculturality, but that kind of idea.
Well, I think it depends on the time period. I mean, I'm looking at a span of about 150 to 200 years, but it starts earlier than that. It starts at 30 BCE, and I'm looking at least 100 years later. By that point, there's already the temple to Isis. The cult has already been, mostly accepted. But in that 100-year run-up, there was a lot of pushback. The cult was banned by the emperor for a period. The temple was not allowed to function for a while, and basically, there's a whole way in which the popularity of Isis sort of stands for what's allowed to be happening in other kind of Egyptian style materials. So when Isis is officially recognized as an allowed cult, there's a really big boom in that kind of material. And you see sort of different ways in which it's expressed. From a political point of view, yes, okay, obelisks, the most famous example, and sphinxes outside the temple, etc. But you do see a lot more sort of terracotta lamps with Egyptian motifs on them, and so there are people using it, I think, for multiple reasons. If you think about the ancient world, the way we think about modern people, they also have layers of identity, like an onion. So you might buy a lamp that has Isis on it because it's popular, because they're mass produced, so they're cheaper, because you like the iconography, you think it's pretty, because you're desperate and it's the first thing you grab, or because you're actually genuinely a devotee of Isis, or because that particular emperor is really into it. There are whole spans of reasons people choose these objects. So I don't think that we should limit our understanding as to, only people who are religious think about Isis, for example, or only people who are political get into descriptions of Egypt. I mean, it's also about aesthetics.
Do you also find, are there variations and differences, as much as we can tell, through either geographical region or through social class?
I think the breadth of objects that are sort of hard stone and therefore harder to move is fairly limited by social class, because who else can afford to get a huge granite statue from Egypt to Rome and then through the streets? Being able to have the power to shut the street down while you're moving this piece, to hire a ship. The obelisks were so big they had to build sort of specialized ships. But also, like, once you say you just want a granite column or a series of them for your temple or for your private house, you've got to wheel them up the road on wooden rollers. It shuts down the traffic for ages, sometimes days. Sometimes it took so long that people were so upset about it that they would have sort of a party where they would throw sort of a parade around it so that the neighborhood wouldn't be so angry at them. You feed them, you give them like throw coins into the street or whatever, just like, please don't trash my stuff.
Don't destroy it. Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, there's a certain element of money and class for especially the larger objects. But for smaller things like terracotta lamps that are made in Rome at the time, and they're mass produced, and many of them are really terrible quality, honestly. I mean, I can't imagine, given how many have survived and given how relatively fragile the material is, I can't imagine that there weren't huge numbers of people with these really terrible quality items, which is also a class indicator that they were not hugely pervasive at some point.
So those were, I'm assuming the lamps were primarily in domestic contexts.
Mostly in domestic contexts, yes. I mean, you do get other forms of lamps in temples and things, but the sort of really bad ones are even in barracks and stuff. You have these lamps for Isis.
Do you find also Egyptianizing objects in funerary contexts?
You do, but not so much as burial goods. I mean, sometimes you'll get rings, etc., with cameos that have various, like Serapis or other Egyptian symbology on them. But a lot of the time, it's actually the priests and priestesses of Isis herself that have this sort of tomb imagery, or their names are directly related to Isis, whether in Greek or Latin. So on the Via Appia, there's a particularly famous tomb of a priestess who's buried with two other people. And there's a sistrum, which is a special kind of Egyptian musical rattle. And she's also holding a pater, like a special bowl used in Isaic rituals using water.
Fascinating. Do you see, I know you work primarily with material culture. Do you see this kind of overlap in literary motifs as well? Do you get Egyptian themes coming through in Roman literature?
So there are quite a lot of inscriptions. As far as literature goes, there's a lot of describing specifically Isis, less so Serapis and Harpocrates and things, because of the power of her cult. And it tends to be, really powerful white men writing about the cult. So sometimes you get objections or sometimes you get descriptions of objections to the cult of Isis, specifically because there were days on which her priestesses and devotees were supposed to abstain from sex, and the husbands who weren't devotees would be very angry about it. So you get writers writing about things like that, or talking about how the mysteries weren't widely available. No one knew what they were. And this whole sort of orientalizing idea that because, so there may have been actual Egyptian priests at various points conducting these ceremonies and living in Rome, because there are many descriptions of sort of mystical languages that were indecipherable, and writing of hieroglyphics as people who can't figure out what's happening and feel like outsiders but really want to know.
Fascinating. So do you, as well as the imagery, do you get a transfer of hieroglyphs, either like using them knowing what they mean, or just using them because they're Egyptian and they're special and interesting?
So keeping in mind that Egyptian at this point, late Egyptian, is really only a language that priests are even learning in Egypt itself at this point. So it tends to be, it's a very difficult language to learn anyway, but it's supplanted in daily usage by Greek and then Latin in Egypt itself. So mainly priests are learning and speaking and writing. So for the things we have in Rome that have hieroglyphics on them, depending on when they're made, that can be an indicator either that the piece was made in Egypt, or that they, had someone write out the inscription and then had a Roman craftsman create it. So there are pieces like Hadrian's obelisk, which was dedicated to his what we think is his lover, based on all the available evidence, Antinous, who drowned supposedly in the Nile on a trip to Egypt. And Hadrian deified him by creating this syncretic god, Antinous Osiris. He had an obelisk created, and we're not sure whether it was in Egypt first, but the hieroglyphics are accurate. So it was clearly done at some point there was a priest who wrote it out, and the granite itself comes from Egypt. The obelisk was in Egypt. We're just not sure whether it was erected there first. So there are things that, but Hadrian himself also had these fanciful wall decorations in his home in Tivoli, and you get just sort of random hieroglyphs that I'm sure were just for aesthetic purposes, unless they decided that this particular sign might have had some mystical association based on their own Roman sensibilities, although that's harder to know for sure. But yeah, it's just, it's here's a beautiful series of wall paintings, and then I'm just going to hide a hieroglyph here. So you get both, even from the same person. So there's a lot of that kind of thing happening.
That's very interesting. So there's a knowledgeable reuse, probably in conjunction with, or there's knowledgeable reuse with the aid of Egyptian priests, but then there's also an aesthetic or a mystical reuse that is not really based in anything Egyptian. It's just like for the look of the things.
Specifically Roman usage, as far as I can tell. Yeah,
that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you. So I actually don't have any more questions about your dissertation. I'm sure that we have several that will come through in the live chat a little bit later on, so we can definitely return to that. But I did very much want to talk to you about increasing diversity in academia, specifically classics for you and ancient Near Eastern studies for me. Historically, currently, both these fields are completely dominated by white, usually male academics. There was a Twitter thread that I think Dr. Moody Al-Rashid wrote yesterday, in which she said, "I have never met a Black Assyriologist," and I haven't ever. I don't think I've even seen one at a conference.
I've never met a Black Egyptologist. I've never met in real life a Black classicist, just on Twitter. So yes, I mean, the field is very distinctly white. I spoke about this at IAC in 2018 as part of a panel about increasing diversity. And it was clear to me that most of the audience members were concerned about gender diversity, and specifically women in classics and archaeology, and less so about people of color. And they just couldn't fathom that we might bring something new to the table, which was shocking to me, honestly. My work is informed every day by my identity as a mixed race person growing up in America, and not really feeling for a long time like I fit in with anywhere really, and thinking about how people would perceive me as sort of being far from home in America, despite it being my country of origin, was what got me interested in Hadrian's collection of Egyptian things. What is this material doing way over here? And are there people over here who know how to read this culturally? And there's no written evidence for that. So this is sort of the tangent that I took instead. But there's a lot of evidence for the fact, most of this work is done in the sciences to measure what diversity does. But there's a lot of evidence that people of color and women innovate at higher rates than other people when they're finally brought into these fields. And I think it's important that classics, especially as a foundation of sort of the white structural power in the Americas and Europe, and elsewhere, obviously, does its best to redress those issues and to not make classics a hostile place for us. It's the least it could do.
Why? So you've already mentioned this briefly, but would you mind talking about why it is so important to have diversity in academia? What does a diverse workforce add to the study of the ancient world?
Well, for the same reason that you want women in your workplace and other genders represented in your workplace, it's because there are things that people are just not going to see if they're part of the dominant discourse that they've never had to question. Everything from hairstyles. There's a particular historian who's very active on YouTube, and I can't remember her name right now, and I feel really bad about that, but maybe we can put it in the comments later, who works on, she worked as a hairstylist. So there were all these male historians saying, that these hairstyles that are in these classical statues of Roman upper class women were fabricated just for statues, that women could never have worn their hair that way. They couldn't fathom how it could be done.
Mm-hmm.
And she, in just a couple of YouTube videos, ripped that to shreds because she knows what she's talking about.
Yeah.
As a long-haired person who works with hair, it's just, there are a ton of these, just even little things, but also big things. When we're talking about history, so often it became the study of warfare, the study of empire, the study of economics. It took so long for the study of the home, for gender studies, et cetera, to become a thing. And honestly, so many people get turned off of the study of classics because it's just it's dates and warfare and violence, and it's really disheartening. I'll give you an example of a way that I personally felt like classics wasn't for me as a younger person, that has continued, and that is the inaccessibility of Latin, and not just because Black people and people of color tend to go to schools where Latin is either not offered or is limited to AP classes, which we are often restricted from due to systemic racism. People think we're not capable of it, which is obviously not true. But the National Latin exam still asks questions in ways that imply that slaves are all either happy or lazy. Dani Bostic has done a lot of really good work on this. And she's also talked about the fact that they had a rent a slave auction as a fundraiser in many National Latin exam and National Latin clubs, high school clubs. So you're teaching people that slavery is okay, that slaves are either lazy or happy to be enslaved, et cetera. So teaching enslaved people that way makes me as a Black person not want to sit in a room full of white people who aren't objecting to this and who are just and it forces me to be the only voice. And then I'm the troublemaker. Then everybody's talking about, why can't I just let it be? There's a lot of pressure to be the voice of Black people or the voice of whatever particular group of color you're in the Latin classroom. And it's very inhospitable. But when I am allowed into the classroom, when I walk into a conference and I give my descriptions of what my thesis work is doing, I'm constantly told, oh my God, I've never thought about it that way. It's so innovative. Are you going to do this? Oh my gosh, I can't wait to hear it. I can't wait to see it published, because nobody but me could do what I'm doing. And that's true of everybody. So we need to broaden it and make it accessible so that all those voices can be heard. Who knows what classics could look like in 10 years if we start now?
No, I think thank you. Beautifully put. Absolutely beautifully put. So how then, acknowledging and accepting that diversity is both necessary and important, how do we go about diversifying academia and classics, and do you know of anything that's already being done to try and kind of kickstart this process or move things along faster?
Well, in classics in particular, but also in ancient Near Eastern history in the UK and US, Black people specifically, but people of color in general, make up less than 2% of the professoriate. And that lack of representation at that level means that the students that people are selecting, because people select students that look like them, they select students that work like them, that have similar training and backgrounds, et cetera, on the whole. So we need more professors first, but also we need universities to recognize that the labor of diversification shouldn't fall on the one Black person in their department. They need to actively take seriously our demands. We've been writing and talking about this for decades. There's a ton of good work out there about diversifying academia, about what is needed, but we need things like equal pay. We need things like a better system where people of color are not ignored for tenure because we also happen to be politically active, because we can't not be. We need to acknowledge that everything from doing internships to field work to library access, all of those things are limited to people who have funding, which traditionally excludes many communities of color. There is no way to get into the museum field, for instance, if you don't do years sometimes of volunteer labor. And many of us don't have the financial background for that, but our parents don't either. We couldn't even live at home for free and be supported. We need people to speak up in the workplace when they see things, whether or not we are present, being said. We know that even at the highest levels of academia, people still feel comfortable saying some ridiculous things.
Horrible things.
Awful, horrible things in public on Twitter. So what are they saying to us when we're the only person in the room with them? I have some pretty horrible stories that I'm not going to share here. Suffice it to say, just being a passive, nice person to the one Black person in your department is not enough. You need to speak up. You need to amplify their voice. And you need to do the work of the reading yourself so that you are better prepared to address these things when they come up. And you need to practice. Sometimes that means practicing in the mirror. What would I say? Get your mouth used to intervening. Get your mouth used to saying, that's not okay. Practice with your friends. Please don't make this work fall on your people of color. Practice with your white friends about how you intervene and what you do. But also things like at conferences, do you provide childcare? Do you provide stipends for workers that and researchers that are unaffiliated? Because a lot of us don't have the sort of connections and networks to get right into a fabulous career in academia, but we still want to go to the conference and our voices need to be heard. Do you take younger scholars, of which people of color tend to be more on the young scale because we get weeded out as we get tired and leave as we get older? Are you really making an effort to make sure that your students of color get the full advantage of your network? Are you really making an effort to explain to them and to your first gen students, this is how academia works and this is what you need to be doing. This is how you need to be thinking 1 year out, 3 years out, so that they can actually prepare and they're not shocked. They're not, sort of, I don't want to say blindsided. I'm trying to get away from ableist language, but they're not completely surprised by things that they didn't know they needed to prepare for, because you don't know what you don't know. So how can you help? How can you write tenure recommendations letters? How can you write better recommendation letters for people of color? Volunteer to do the work. Don't make us ask you for everything.
And one of the things that jumps out at me a lot reading people's accounts on Twitter and that kind of thing is that by forcing Black people and people of color to advocate so strongly for themselves, we're taking away the energy that they have for their research, for learning, for career development, because, well, I as a white woman can very comfortably ignore that this is a problem and carry on with my life, and it really doesn't affect me personally. And I can keep going with my career, and I can write papers and present in conferences. It's not something that a Black scholar, a scholar of color, can ignore, because it is a very real, very tangible barrier to their career. So they have to address it. They're forced to address it, which means that they don't have the time to spend writing and researching that as a white person I do. So I think it's crucial for me as a white person, for the rest of the scholarly community, as white people, to stand up and say, this is not okay. This is a thing I can do to change it, and you should not have to bear this burden by yourself.
Yes, and on the occasion when we need to be the people whose voices are heard, because it's more important to amplify our voices than it is to speak for us, obviously, pay us for our emotional labor. This is not free for us. It takes a real toll, and it eats up time I could be using to write articles or do research. Having to navigate all of that, the fact that when I walk into an archive, no one thinks I should be there, and it's very clear. I do a lot of my work in Italy and the UK in archives, and the treatment I get is very different than other people when I walk through the door. And I have to prepare myself emotionally for that every day before I go to work. Every day before I go to a conference, I know that there will be people whose work I have been dying to speak to them about. They're way high in the field, and they might actually talk to me because it says Harvard or Heidelberg on my badge. But they're always going to ask, and I have never, without fail, never not had someone ask me this question when we're talking about work. Oh, but you're not Egyptian? No. Oh, then why? So, but you're not, why are you doing classics again? Like every time. And I have to sit there and make nice at dinner because my career is affected by these people. This is my network. And the work of doing that, and then also having to stand up and explain to every department I'm ever in why diversity is important. The work of having to have my conference presentations be about that instead of my work, instead of my research. The work of having to mentor younger students because there's no one else to do it. All of that falls on me as a PhD student. And I think it will probably only get worse as I get more visible and get more requests for free emotional labor. And it's exhausting. And many of us are having these same struggles. I mean, Twitter is alight with us saying it this week.
Full of it.
Full of it. So if you can do some of that emotional labor, do it. And if you can't do the emotional labor, pay us to do it. Like, that's the easiest way for me to say, for you to convey to me that you value what I'm bringing to the table.
For people who are interested in this kind of thing and really what this emotional labor might look like, there are a myriad of people on Twitter. I'm going to try and find some links and put them in the description. There's also a woman named Tori who runs a site called White Homework. And her Twitter threads are fantastic. They are educational. They are deeply uncomfortable reading as a white person, but for the love of God, read them.
Please send me that link. I'm fascinated.
I definitely will. And this is important stuff to do. And it's really not an awful lot to ask, all things considered. We can take a few minutes of our day and read through other people's experiences and think about, how am I contributing to this? How am I able to help change things so that it's not so ridiculously unbearable for other people? So one thing that I have come across and tried to argue vehemently against is the incorrect argument that if really any scholars, but specifically scholars of color, just work hard and are good researchers, they'll be fine. They'll succeed. No additional measures are necessary. Affirmative action is deeply unfair and probably racist against white people.
Shall I respond?
That's bullshit. If you feel able and would like to, then go for it. If you do not, then that's absolutely fine.
Okay, so first off, the biggest beneficiaries for affirmative action are white women in the US, across the board, at every university. You can see the effects of affirmative action by the number of white women who are able to enter the academy now. But diversity isn't just white women. So when we are talking about what scholars of color face, if it were true that all you have to do is be a fantastic scholar, then you only have two options to extrapolate from that. Either we are all crap scholars. Every person of color in America is a crap scholar of classics and ancient history. Or there are other barriers that are preventing us from becoming professors and museum directors and other things. I don't see how you can think either one of those paths is, well, let me start over. I don't see how you can see that white women have done so well, given the same level of sort of barrier removal efforts, and people of color have not. So obviously what is working for white women is not enough to get over the barriers that are still in place for people of color, especially women of color. So more needs to be done to make it equitable for us to join the field, to stay in the field. And all of these people who think these things, like, it's evident in their responses to us in department meetings, in the way that they themselves promote us. All those people who say, oh, if you just do well, you'll be fine, are the same people who say, oh, I don't know what it is, but I don't think that they fit with our culture. And they don't think twice about recognizing their own,
what that means. Yeah,
exactly. It's just a way of saying, they make me uncomfortable and I don't want them here. So we see you, we know what you're doing, and we need to find institutional ways of working around you, because we're fed up with it and it can't keep on this way. It's absurd that there are many universities in the UK and the US who have 0 Black professors, including many who have tweeted out their support for Black people this week. So we're watching you.
And something that again has come out very strongly through Twitter is just saying you support something is not enough.
No,
it's great that you do, but you have to do something about it. And that can be difficult, that can be uncomfortable, but you have to do something. Speaking of doing things, I know there are a few organizations that are working to help with funding for Black students, especially in the classics. Are there any that you think are doing a particularly good job?
Well, Sportula US was an organization founded by scholars of color, specifically a lot of Black classicists, grad students who do fundraising for microgrants, basically solidarity work for people who are struggling and who are in classics and classics adjacent fields, to apply for help for anything from buying a book that you need to study, to paying a conference fee, to maybe you can't afford your cell phone bill that month. And they've just opened, there's a new branch, Sportula Europe, which is working on focusing more on not just classics, but ancient Mediterranean studies, sort of Silk Road, basically anybody who falls into that category who needs assistance in Europe, because there are more than people think. I'm in Europe now as a grad student, so people think there aren't very many of us, but I think it's because we are silenced, we're invisible in these places a lot of times, but we're here and we need help. So Sportula is doing a great job. Women's Classical Caucus has a temporary grant program during the COVID-19 epidemic. And there are some others. I can run up a list.
Please, that would be wonderful. I do. If people are interested, I have put Sportula's information in the description because I follow them on Twitter. And actually, we are patrons of them. So they have a Patreon account to help with fundraising. If this is something that is of interest to you, if you think it's important, those details are in the description box below. So please go and show your support. And we have about 15 minutes before we finish. So I am going to bring Josh in and he is going to give us all of the audience questions. Hello, my love.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing okay. All right. So if other people do have questions, please put them in the side chat and I'll try to grab them. Okay. So how much religious exchange was there between Rome and Egypt?
So again, that's a question that has to do with sort of long time. There's this sort of idea that everything stays the same during the Egyptian-Roman relationship, but it lasts for hundreds of years, even before Rome's conquest of Egypt. So first, when the Greeks were ruling Egypt in the form of the Ptolemies, you get this sort of Greekified Egyptian religion that makes its way around the Mediterranean. And since Romans were really into following a lot of Greek trends, they start there in some places, and it spreads like wildfire through sailors and soldiers and people who are going back and forth that way. So there's a lot of religious intermixing. There are a lot of sort of Eastern cults in Rome. Their temples had to be built outside the city walls, but the temple to Isis was still, despite that sort of marginalization, if you want to call it that, was one of the biggest temple spaces in Rome, and had so many heavy granite objects that I described the moving process for. They must have been extraordinarily wealthy and popular. So, I mean, there are a lot of people in Rome following these cults and mixing their own personal religion with Egyptian religion until it becomes its own unique form of Roman religion.
Interesting. Okay, Iron Charioteer says, ask Bet, what was the influence of Philo of Alexandria on Egypt? How did Jewish writers and philosophers influence Rome?
So I don't specifically work on textual evidence. I'm an archaeologist and a material studies person. So there are quite a lot of Jewish writers who are read by very well-educated people in Rome, but I'm not sure what their influence in Egypt would be. I know that, for instance, in Rome, there are probably not so many people reading the more religious aspects of the writing, but more interested in things like Josephus, like the more political and historiographic kind of writing.
Okay. Tessa asks, are there historians looking into LGBTQ history?
Absolutely. But it's complicated because we don't necessarily have a way of identifying how people would have identified themselves. So it's very complicated when you're trying to gender people in the past, because we don't know if they had such strict ideas of like, so for instance, a trans person may well have been accepted and we don't know. It's harder to do DNA tests on ancient skeletons, but especially in places like Egypt is very dry, material is preserved longer, and we still have trouble with DNA. Rome is built in a swamp and things degrade really quickly. So even if we had evidence of, say, they've chosen to be represented as female on their tomb, but we can see via DNA that they have two X chromosomes, they have an X and a Y chromosome, then so we don't have a real way of doing that. So even if we were to try to apply modern constructs of gender to the ancient past, it would be very complicated. We do know, for instance, like Hadrian, like I was talking about, the way that he writes about Antinous, the way that he wept over Antinous, the way that he describes Antinous's body, the way that he created a whole religion so that Antinous could be guaranteed to live on in the afterlife, etc. All of those are really strong indicators that they had a gay relationship, but Hadrian was also married. Now, is that marriage political, or is that marriage one where they actually tried for children, etc.? Like, there's no way to tell if he's bi or gay or doesn't identify as either of those things. We just have, there's a lot of work to be done. It's just very complicated to do it.
Mr. Snow asks, were there any seemingly contradictory fusions between Roman and Egyptian gods? I know Artemis was typically synchronized with married goddesses. Are there any more examples?
Well, for instance, sometimes Romans put together two Egyptian gods in a really weird way. So one of the black marble statues that's in the Vatican has Osiris on one side and the Apis bull on the other side of the same statue. It's one of those sort of Janus-headed statues. I think for me, it's more about the way they group things. So sometimes Osiris is his own identity, and sometimes he's Serapis, but Isis is always Isis in whatever guise she takes. And then sometimes it's Horus, and sometimes it's Harpocrates, which is the sort of Romanized version of him. So you get like weird combinations of the Holy Family Trinity, which are sometimes more Egyptian and sometimes more Roman or Ptolemaic. So yeah, I mean, they do very strange combinations, but not as many Egyptian gods came over as Greek gods. So there's a lot less opportunity for restructuring in that way.
Okay. We have two more questions. Iron Charioteer asks, could you ask Bet, how do we stop the brain drain to Wall Street? People want a quick MBA to become a hedge fund manager and retire a millionaire at 35 instead of putting in the work.
Well, I think if other careers were compensated the way they should be, then people would go into other careers. I went into financial marketing because I was going to starve otherwise. They were the only people who were guaranteed to give me great healthcare, and I hated my job. But I mean, the people I worked with were all really nice people, but at the same time, you're doing something you don't feel great about every day. And I knew I wanted to change. But once you're in it as well, how do you make that sort of change over? I went back to school, but I also learned how to, like through marketing, learned how to market myself. So now when I talk about museums, I can talk about things like how I can read their business plan and talk about its efficacy. I can talk about public-private partnerships with authority. I can talk about tax benefits. I can talk about traffic flows. I can do, cost-benefit analyses of various things, in addition to my other skills about materiality analysis and all of those kinds of things. So, I mean, we have to teach people, just like any other career, that their skills can be used in very different ways. We have to start them younger, like start at the university level and convince people that archaeology is worth studying because of the analytical skills that it teaches you, for instance. So even if you wanted to go into hedge funding, for instance, afterward, there are a lot of people who get hired because archaeology teaches you how to deal with databases, with analyses, with different kinds of materials, with case studies, et cetera. So basically, we need to convince younger people and parents that these sorts of careers are worthwhile and are effective. But for that to be true, we need to change the field so that tenure is not so unachievable, so that not so many people are on temporary teaching contracts, struggling to make things work, so that museums are not a secondary career option if you can't make it as a professor, et cetera. There's a lot to be done so that people feel like they have options.
That's good. A lot of uphill. It's an uphill battle.
Yeah.
So last
I'm out here every day trying.
So Archeo Lilith asks, do you have an idea of how undergrad students without much influence can help diversify our fields of study?
There are a lot of ways undergrads in particular can be really effective because y'all are where the money is. So if you speak up for us, if you talk to your admin about, I really think that this person's work is of value, that goes into their tenure folder, which is great. But also, if you as students demand when there's a job opening that it be filled by a person of color, there's no reason for the university not to listen to you except for just being jerks. I mean, if you sign a petition saying this department is too white, you need more people on the tenure track, you need more TAs, you need more people of color who are grad students, we have no queer representation, can we get on that? You as students have, even if it's student loan money, that's still your money that you are paying the school, and they don't want to see it dry up. They want you to donate as alumni after the fact, so they don't want your experience to be miserable en masse anyway. Basically, what you can do that I can think of are a few things. You can see if there's a union at your school. If you're allowed to, because sometimes undergraduates aren't, you can join it. And if you aren't allowed to join it, you can ask them how you can materially support them. You can not cross picket lines when your professors are picketing for better pay or for increasing diversity. You can bring up these topics in your discussions in lectures, although that's sometimes a little anxiety inducing. Imagine what it's like for the person of color in the room to be the only one, and just try and be a little bit bolder. You can talk to your professor at their office hours. Office hours are meant for undergraduate students to bring up issues like this. So you can talk to your department heads, you can talk to your TAs over coffee, just even informal discussions to let us know that you appreciate the work we're doing would be very nice and a big step forward.
I assume that things like filling out class evaluation forms, paying more attention if you have a professor of color, like really what you say about them and how you say it, because again, that helps with tenure. I
also because people of color and often women, and very much so for people who are both, get really negative, much more negative reviews for the same work.
Mm-hmm.
So they are perceived more negatively than their white male colleagues. And so sometimes if you have like smaller issues with the professor, going to a professor to talk about it is maybe a better way to address that than writing a flaming review, because they're probably going to get a lot worse feedback than other people doing the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
A few more questions came in. If we've got time, though, I'm looking at the clock.
Are you okay to have a couple more questions, Bet?
Yes.
Thank you.
So Dara Wilson asks, Bet, how do you find the motivation to keep moving forward given the many barriers you have on your road to success in your field?
The answer is some days I don't, but I try to imagine what my life would be like if I quit this. Like, I'm going to be doing this in whatever field I'm going to be in. You know, it doesn't matter if I do this or if I go back to financial marketing and make a lot of money. I had the same issues there as I have in this field. The difference being in this field, I can make a material difference for people who come after me. And that is something that I feel very strongly puts not pressure in a bad way, but sort of compels me forward, compels me to keep doing the work, because there are so few of us. I mean, really, like I said, I've never met another one in person. There are so few of us that if I disappear, that like halves the population of Black classicists in Germany, I'm sure. So I'm doing my best, even though I don't have that much power as a PhD student. I'm doing my best so that when I get up to the upper level, people know who I am, people respect me for my work, and people take my voice seriously. I'm preparing the path now for me and everybody else. And I just try to hold on to that. It's hard. Some days are harder than others, and some days feel nigh on impossible, but it has to be done. I feel like if I quit, I would be a lot sorrier than if I stayed.
Scott Duke just put a super chat up for $4.99. Thank you very much, Scott.
Good job, Scott.
How are new technologies being employed to make museum visits both engaging and educational?
So this is something I'm really interested in, and this is specifically what I want to do in museums, in Egyptology and classics collections, is to bring more accessibility, but also more interactive ways of dealing with objects. So there are all kinds of ways tech can be used. Everything from full immersion virtual reality experiences, although those are very expensive, to things like 3D printing copies of objects that are in a museum so that people who are blind can touch them and get more, not just blind people, everybody, but for people that have more access to collections who would not. There are a lot of people who want to be more interactive with collections in various ways. So you can do anything from encouraging people, if your collection is fully digitized, to create their own sort of display, putting together things in interesting ways. And then from there, you know, sharing that with other people and broadening your idea of what a museum is also great for people who maybe can't afford a museum visit, or who live too far away, etc., or who find mobility difficult. So yes, I'm really interested in basically applying tech to the furthest of its ability within, but ethically. So I think that if you're going to apply new tech, you need to do a lot of work to make sure it's accessible to disabled people, not just physically, but also who are non-neurotypical, etc. You need to make sure that you're talking to communities about how they think tech would be useful for them. And you have to try to work within your museum's budget, which can also be sometimes the biggest barrier, honestly. But as things become more popular, they will become more cost effective. So I'm really hoping to see museums get into sort of augmented reality and virtual reality much more in the future. But again, like I said, 3D printed models is something I'm doing as part of my own thesis, because I know a lot of people who have difficulty imagining spaces, who want to be able to walk around a thing and look at how things would have been displayed or move them around or something like that. And for me, I think it's one of the easiest ways to make things more interesting is tactile displays.
Yeah, no doubt.
One of the things that always bugged me as a child was going to museums and not being allowed to touch anything.
as a child. Come on.
It still bugs me if we're very honest, but I restrain myself more than I did. So
there's a really nice part of the museum, the Archaeological Museum in Florence, Italy, that has reconstructions of Etruscan vases that are in the Florence collection. And they have Etruscan chanting, so you can hear things,
wow.
You can touch things. And when the exhibition first started, they also had like recreated scents, although they didn't keep refilling them, unfortunately. But they do try to, they have this one particular section that's really lovely, that really got me thinking about, why do we have to say no touching ever to things? Why not touch all the things?
That sounds really cool.
2 more questions, and then I think that'll be it, everybody. So Michael Roble asks, it seems that the Romans were the ultimate polytheists. Is that a fair assessment?
I think there are a lot of people in the ancient world, including the Greeks, who are borrowing and melding and doing really interesting things all over the place. It's just that we hear more about Rome. There's a lot of, like, the spread of ISIS, for instance, further east should be as interesting to people, but it's not covered, because we don't have the basis in, say, Assyriology, etc., in Western schools as we do in Greco-Roman history. It does make it seem that way, but there's a lot of Silk Road trade. There's a lot of, Egyptian gods that make their way into Ethiopia and further afield. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people whose gods get rolled up in a lot of things and wind up in Rome. This is true, but a large portion of that has to do with it being the heart of the empire economically, and how much trade and people are going back and forth. And how much we know about those other people, which on a scholastic level, there are many people who are experts. That's not what I mean to say. What I mean to say is, like, from a layperson level, or someone who doesn't do specifically Middle Eastern, Near Eastern studies, it can seem that way.
Last question. Iron Chariots here asks, how does Bet feel about education paid for all? Do you think it might stop the brain drain to Wall Street?
Absolutely. If I didn't have to pay student loans, my whole life would be a lot easier, first off, but also the things I thought I could do were fairly limited based on, because I didn't come from a family of money. I didn't know what job options were. Even after years as an undergrad at Harvard, I didn't realize that you could make a career doing archaeology. I didn't realize that being a museum person was in any form was like a real job that you could use to pay off student loans, which, I mean, really isn't, but not the sort of job you can use to pay off student loans, but hey. The problem is twofold. I think that people are not aware in time to make some of the decisions when they have more resources and more familial support is expected to do things like internships or field schools in all kinds of fields. And two, I think that once we've signed away all of these student loans, we feel pressure to make so much money to pay them off. And there's pressure to live a certain kind of lifestyle with a certain kind of house, a certain kind of car, etc. One of the things I really like about Europe is that I can not own a car and still live a very full and active life and get into nature and such. That's not so possible, and it's not possible at all in the place I grew up, and it's not possible in most of America. And I think if we had free education, the way that is an option here, where really the only thing you have to do is worry about how you pay for food, or better yet, pay for food, then students who are struggling at home, who spend all of this brain energy on thinking about how to feed themselves, on thinking about how much money do I have to earn to buy a winter coat so I don't freeze, and instead of doing their chemistry studying, they're working their third job or something. All of that creative energy that goes into dealing with poverty and dealing with other social issues could be put to much better uses. And I really do think that we'd have much better social services, that with much better social services, we'd have a much stronger volunteer-based basis. People would feel free to give their time because they wouldn't need to spend it working during university, et cetera. I think all free education for all is a big thing for me.
Mhm.
And it's possible everywhere else. Why can't we do it in the States?
That is an excellent question.
Well, that's all the questions.
good?
My
Okay,
job
well-
is done.
Your job is...
Thanks for listening in, everybody who dialed in. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was fun. Thank you again so much for coming on. I really enjoyed it, and hopefully we gave people some things to think about, both about the fantastic world of Roman Egypt relations, which is I love that kind of cultural interaction. It's wonderful, and about how to increase diversity in classics and elsewhere. So thank you again, Bet, for joining us. This was lots of fun. Thank you everyone for watching, and remember, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?